I'm back. Another episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Woohoo! All right, so I'm fired up. If you can't tell, I'm fired up. Yesterday was a fun, fulfilling day in the life of Ryan Thomas. I accomplished so much stuff that I am very excited about. The future for the podcast, very excited for the future of Ryan Thomas, very excited in general, very happy. So, I had to deal with some people that needed to be dealt with accordingly on Facebook, and that is expected. You got the keyboard warriors. I am a keyboard monster, you could call me. And part of this, I expected this. When I made this podcast and I put my opinions out there for other people to hear, I expected to have people jump down my throat anytime I made a comment. I expected people to say, nitpick me and whatever. Just be the boring people that they are and find nothing to do with their time but jump down people's throats and hate on what people are trying to accomplish. That's fine. If you guys want to do that, that is A-okay by me. The train is not going to stop. The Thomas Takeover is just beginning. So you guys can hate all you want. That is more than okay. But it's not going to stop me. I'm going to keep coming like the raging bull that Jake LaMotta was in the ring. And that's it. So with that being said, today's episode is dedicated to UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley made some comments to ESPN today that caught my attention, and it's a controversial topic, and it shouldn't be. We live in a day and age where I am a white male that really cares for all race, all people. I really do. People that are, of different sexual preference, I don't, it doesn't bother me. I come from a family, my brother is a gay man. I have friends that are black, white, Latino. The color of someone's skin does not matter to me. That doesn't change my perspective on who they are as a person. I believe that rather than the color of one's skin, it should be the character of that individual that should personify who they are rather than the color. I'd hate for someone to walk up to me and say, "Hey, I met Ryan, that white guy." I'd like for them to say, "Hey, I met Ryan, he's a funny guy." That's how I would rather be perceived. And Tyron Woodley went on ESPN today on SportsCenter, and he claimed that his race has affected his stature as a UFC welterweight champion, saying, and I quote, "the worst treated champion in the history of the UFC." He suggested that the UFC hasn't promoted him as well as other champions, nor has the fan base embraced him like other champions. Excuse me. He said, "Let's put the cards on the table. Real is real. If I was a different complexion, I think people and fans would treat me a different way." Woodley is 34. He's scheduled to defend his 170-pound title against Stephen Thompson at UFC 209 on March 4th in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, let me cut through that. Let me cut that off because that was from an article I read by Brett Okamoto. He wrote, the quotes. He gave me the information on that article. He did the interview, not me. So the only thing I'm going to do with that information is kind of dissect it and give my opinion on what Tyron Woodley is saying. So, Tyron Woodley is saying that he's the worst treated champion in the history of the UFC, and he thinks the color of his skin and his race determines that. Determines the fact that he has not been promoted, and I disagree 100%. That has nothing to do with race. There have been black champions, African American champions, Latino champions, Brazilian champions that have been promoted far more than Tyron Woodley has, and there's a reason for that. Tyron Woodley is not the most attention-grabbing fighter. Personality-wise outside the octagon. He doesn't have the trash talk ability. He doesn't have the just allure that most fighters have. John Jones was the youngest champion in UFC history. He had charisma. He had the ability to. He had the face. He had the body. It sounds weird, but he had all the athletic tools in his repertoire to display, to put on display. He finished fights, and he did it consistently over a long time, defending his title again and again and again. Tyron Woodley has been the champion for not that long. Back in, I think it was, what one was it? Was it UFC 201, I believe? Was when Robbie Lawler defended his belt against Tyron Woodley, or at least tried to, and Robbie Lawler lost his belt. That happened, and from there, obviously Woodley was the champion, and Woodley's next fight, that was actually in July. He's been the champion since July of 2016, not long ago, 6-7 months ago. And he defends his title on the biggest pay-per-view of all time, UFC 205, in Madison Square Garden. He's the co-main event on one of the biggest cards in the history of mixed martial arts, the biggest card in the history of mixed martial arts. He defends his belt against the number one contender, who he avoided, and says that he is treated unfairly. In that fight where he fought the number one contender that he avoided for the majority of that July to November, calling out guys like Nick Diaz and GSP who haven't fought in almost 3 years, or over 3 years in the case of GSP, he fights Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to a draw. Where he defended his belt by not losing and not winning. That's his only title defense as a UFC welterweight champion. That is reality. So the fact is, he's jumping the gun a little bit by throwing out the fact that he doesn't think people treat him that well because of his race. Mixed martial arts has embraced fighters of color. Anderson Silva is a Brazilian fighter. Rashad Evans, Hall of Famer. John Jones, no matter what mistakes he makes outside the octagon, MMA just keeps bringing him back. Melvin Gillard. Derek Lewis. Man, there are a lot more than this, too. Melvin Manhoef. He just passed away, and I'm just passed away, and I'm drawing a blank. Rampage Jackson. There's been multiple fighters of color that have been some of the biggest names in the sport for quite some time. And Kevin Randleman, that's who I'm referring to. Kevin Randleman was one of the biggest stars in mixed martial arts history, whether it be in Pride or the UFC. Alistair Overeem, one from each division practically. Carlos Newton. There are so many guys that Daniel Cormier, Anthony Johnson, two guys, Yoel Romero. There's a lot of guys that have been embraced by the mixed martial arts community and by the world of mixed martial arts. Tyron Woodley was in Strikeforce at one point. He was trying to become the Strikeforce welterweight champion, and in doing so, he was pretty disrespectful to his opponents. And people remember that stuff. People remember all of that stuff. And it's not the fact that Tyron Woodley is an African-American man as to why the fans boo him. They boo him because he's boring. He doesn't have the appeal that a Rampage Jackson has, or a John Jones has, or a Rumble Johnson has. He just doesn't have it. And he comes off as if he deserves to have that acclaim already, and he hasn't earned it. He's only defended his title one time, and it was a draw. It was a draw. So he didn't win the fight, he didn't lose the fight, but he went home with his belt. Rightfully so or not, whether people thought he won that fight or whether he lost that fight, 3 judges decided he didn't win or lose. He did just enough to warrant a draw, as did his opponent in Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. I'm a little disappointed, to be honest, that he would make remarks like that. As a champion, he should put his head, keep his head up, take his time, realize that he's got a rematch in front of him with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. After the fight being a draw, the UFC decides to put it together for an immediate rematch. He should put that fight front of mind, blow Stephen Thompson out of the water, and then stake his claim that that fight was not a draw. He won the first fight, which I thought he did, and take over from there. Become a face, not a heel. Don't be a heel because people don't want you to be. He's already come too far as far as trying to be the heel, people booing him and him saying, I love it, and then he says he's disrespected. He's saying he loves to be booed. The fans are going to boo you. They're not going to say, well, we're just booing him for the hell of it. They're booing him because he told them he liked it. So it doesn't make much sense to me. I don't understand where he is going with this. And in the history of the UFC, he's the most disrespected champion. He's been the champion since July. Technically, he's a figurehead of the division. He hasn't even won a title defense yet. It's not about whether he's black, white, Mexican, Brazilian, Canadian, whatever he may be. It's not about that. It's about his legitimacy in the sport. People don't see him as a legitimate champion yet because he hasn't defended his belt yet. That's what it is. I guarantee you that's what it is because I've been a fan of the sport for a long, long time. And since the beginning, practically, since I was a little kid. And I saw champions of color be embraced by the MMA community. Marvin Eastman was a guy. Jorge Rivera was a guy. Dean Thomas was a guy that was embraced. Kevin Randleman, as I said earlier, when he died, it was trending on Twitter as like the 3rd highest topic on Twitter. It was the highest talked about MMA topic of the day. Died of cardiac arrest at age 40. That was a terrible loss. He was a champion. He was respected. He didn't clap when the fans booed him. If anybody wants to say they're the most disrespected African-American champion in the history of the UFC, I'd say Daniel Cormier could say that, but he does not. He just keeps his head up, continues to focus on his career, and doesn't worry and doesn't acknowledge the fans. He acknowledges the fans that are fans of him, that support him, but he doesn't beg for the fans to boo him and then say, well, I'm disrespected. You asked to be disrespected. You clapped while being disrespected. That wasn't your way of laughing it off. That's what you told us as fans, that you liked it. I don't get it. I really don't get it. And I think that it makes the UFC look really bad, him saying these things. I think he wants to be known as somebody that's brash, that stands up for a bigger cause. And his next quote was saying, going into the last fight, I feel like Wonderboy was promoted as the champion. I'm the champion. I knocked out the baddest welterweight in the world in Robbie Lawler in record-breaking time. I don't get the respect I deserve. Don't have him walk out with the American flag like I'm from a different country. Don't have him paraded around. Don't have everything revolve around him. Woodley has been a betting underdog in 7 consecutive fights. The reason why he has been an underdog, though, is because not enough people know about him. Only the people do that are really diehard fans. And I'm one of them. So the casual fans don't know enough yet. And when they do, I am certain, as long as Woodley continues to be the champ and defend his belt, winning in title defenses, he will become a huge star. That was the Thomas Take. Thanks for tuning in.